I remember him like actually really communicating with the engineer. You know, I mean, and he was never at the board. I mean, he was never there, but like he was communicating with the engineer and telling him, you know, what he wanted certain instruments to sound like. You know, because the song we came in with when we worked with him was completely different than what we came out with, you know? I mean, and my favorite thing I like to say about that is he turned the Voidoids into a pop band, which, you know, that's a giant wall to climb.
You were all kind of young, snotty punks at the time. Was there pushback on that idea?
With him, no. It was weird. With anybody else, it might have, and with Gotterer, it was for sure, you know. But with him, no, it wasn't because of his approach. And I mean, he even changed, you know, guitar parts, and I mean, you know, the essence of the song. I mean, and we didn't seem to mind because we realized it was better.
Elvis Costello produced "Tempted" by Squeeze, and apparently it was just like an entirely different song. He suggested they do it in a Motown style, and then, you know, rockets up the chart. It's kind of wild, and I think one of the most useful things that a producer can do and is sort of being that outside voice, you know, being somebody who is like not. It's like anything else in this world, you know. If you're immersed in something all day, you're in this band all day, you have certain ideas about the way certain things should go, and then somebody comes in from the outside and it's like, oh yeah, that's something that we didn't even try or think of.
Mm-hmm. And usually there's pushback with that because the band goes, well, no, this is our song. I mean, and we had pushback, you know, when we were making Blank Generation as well. I mean, and it's a good thing we pushed back because a lot of the ideas that were presented to us weren't good. I mean, but with Nick has that thing where, I mean, and a lot of great producers do that. He's talented in knowing what should sound right, and he knows how to present it without alienating anyone.
Was he brought in by the label?
Well, not Sire Records, no, because at the time we got kicked off Sire Records. So Jake Riviera, Elvis Costello's manager, had a label, and he brought Nick in. You know, Jake Riviera brought Nick in to produce a single. So yes, he did do that.
When you say he was kind of a mentor and taught you a lot through that process of recording, I think that song and maybe a B-side, what were some of the lessons you learned that you took with you?
How to be a producer without being authoritarian, and how to listen to a song and see that there's possibilities to change it completely, and have it sound better, and being able to communicate with the engineer. I mean, I engineer myself because I have a recording studio, but I mean, it's like, I mean, I never saw Nick sit down at the board. He was just like constantly telling the engineer, well, this, that, you know, and I want this EQ and that EQ. Yeah. I mean, and those things. But most importantly, it's the vibe in the studio because, I mean, you're in this, like, you know, this space, this isolated space with just, you know, the band and whomever, and you're there for hours and hours and hours. And it's very easy for the mood to turn sour. You know, especially if you have more than one person, and even with one person, it can turn sour. You know, so I mean, that was the biggest lesson. It's like, you know, just how to cajole everybody to like, okay, we're here to make the record. Let's do this. You know, I mean, yeah.
Richard's one of I think the 5 or 6 people I mentioned that you've worked with that I've had on the show, and he could be difficult. I feel like I was getting a little bit of that in the interview, maybe, and like. When working with artists in the studio like that, and when you are that kind of like outside force, you've got to be really mindful of the fact that a lot of musicians are very understandably attached to their vision.
Yes. I mean, I can't remember right now who produced Metallica's Black Album, you know, but that was the story with that. I mean, you know who did that? I can't remember. I have to go look at my stuff. But that was the story with that because he came in with all these ideas, and they're like, you can't tell us what to do, you know, and gradually the mood softened, and then he got his thing across, and then they had an amazingly great album. But I mean, it happens a lot,
especially like first records, I assume, you know, coming in, like you've never done this before, you've never been through this process before, but you assume that you know everything about it.
Yeah, because you've written the songs and you've, you know, formed the band, whatever. Excuse me. Yeah,
you've got a studio in Williamsburg. I kind of get the impression, and correct me if I'm wrong, that production, or at least that sort of like being in and managing the studio, is what takes up most of your time these days.
I ran there from there to here today, so yeah, it does. I mean, also because it's an analog studio. I mean, and it's kind of a carousel of things being broken, and that's another thing I've learned is how to repair gear. So I mean, and it's fairly busy right now. So I mean, yeah, it does take up a lot of my time. Yeah.
That's rare to have a fully or even like mostly analog studio at this point. So obviously it's a lot easier to produce things on a computer, but and there's an argument to be made for warmth and sound and things like that, but you just don't come across too many analog studios in 2022.
Well, no one can afford it. No one can afford the maintenance. I mean, because the maintenance, I mean, luckily I can fix it myself. That's the only reason it exists. Otherwise, we'd be sending things out all the time, costing $400,000 or $500 a throw, And also it takes up space. It's not like a desktop with a computer. You need room for all this stuff, I mean, but I've often, when everyone else was moving forward, I was racing backwards because I was trying to find out, what analog gear is really great and what can I find for cheap. And, it's integrated because we have that with, Pro Tools, of course. And what people do when they can afford it is they record everything to 2-inch tape, and then we dump it into Pro Tools and we lock the two together because admittedly, I mean, Pro Tools is easier to mix in than analog, it just is, right? Unless you have like 4 or 5 people with their hands and feet on the board and everything. And tubes sound better. Tubes just sound better. I had someone from Ampex, a guy who used to work for Ampex when I was learning all this, tell me the reason why tubes sound better as opposed to transistors. And he said, because there's a glitch when the sine wave goes across the zero axis that existed in all transistors. And there's nothing they can do about it. I mean, they've gotten better and better at modeling it, but tubes don't do that. It's just a flow. Also, when we bought our 2-inch machine, we got tapes from the guy that we bought it from. And I worked with 2-inch before, of course, but I hadn't really heard it in about a year and a half or 2 years at the time. And I listened to these tapes and I thought, why does it sound so warm? And it's the air. The air is not being quantized. The air is not being turned into ones and zeros. The air is like being mushed up, and it sounds smooth and warm. And that's really what it is. Not so much the recording of the instruments that are being, and audio that are being recorded. It's like the air that's being recorded between the mic and the amplifier or the person or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, the instruments as well. I mean, as far as recording it in a physical studio and having that kind of space is also helps.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we're lucky to have a fairly large space, and then it definitely helps. I mean, and there's a lot of factors, especially if you live in New York City. It's like, our building is unattached from anyone, so we don't have the police raiding us in the middle of the night. But with that can happen, so. When
did it open?
That space has been there for a while. 2017 was when I moved to the space, and I installed all my gear into the studio.
It was a studio previously?
It's an art space, actually. The front of the building, if you could think of this, it's a kind of a long, wide rectangle. The front of the building is an art gallery, okay, that has art shows and a performance space. The middle part of the building is what we call the live room, where I record bands, and there's a back section that's smaller where I have the control room and a vocal booth. Okay, so it was never. I mean, they had recording gear there. They had what you were talking about. They had like a computer and this and that. And I said, well, I have all this stuff, including James Brown's reverb plate that I recorded. Papa's Got a Brand New Bag on.
How did you come across that?
Okay. Story. I had left my old studio, but when I left my old studio, I realized, after I didn't have a mixing board, and I needed to get one. So I was shopping around for one, and I found one in Charlotte, North Carolina. And this guy who was kind of brokering stuff around town, he had that, and he had James Brown, the plate that James Brown used to record Papa's Got a Brand New Bag on. And he was selling both of them. And I thought to myself, okay, so my wife and we flew down, rented a U-Haul, and saw the plate, and I thought, I saw the board, and I thought, well, this is much larger than I thought it was going to be, but we'll get it in there somehow. And then we went over and we got the plate, and that too was the size of a queen size bed. And I thought, I can't come down here without getting this plate. I mean, it's James Brown's plate. It's like, so, and it sounds amazing. It sounds so much better than any of the modeling things, that you hear, the digital things. You hear the real actual plate. It's amazing sound.
You talked about the price of upkeep, but it sounds like this was a pretty huge investment up front.
It's a bit in pieces, you have like maybe. So somehow you happen to have an extra $1,000. Like, it's a funny thing. Like, the people told me when I first got into this, they go, "Oh, it's only $1,000." I'm like, "What?" It's like $1,000 or $1,000. But like, you have a little money here and there. I mean, and you buy it piece by piece. I mean, I have these Ampex mic pre's that are actually tape recorder mic pre's. I have like 4 of them, I think. 4. And anyway, when I first started buying them, they were $400. Now they're like $2,000. So you just find things, and you don't. At least I can't afford to buy it all at once.
Yeah, I mean, somebody says only $1,000, but you're a working musician living in New York City.
Exactly. So that whenever they say that, I just go, yeah, well, maybe for you, but but I managed to acquire things over the years. I mean, I sometimes I think and I look at it and I go, you have a lot of stuff here, but I mean, you really bought it piece by piece by piece over the course of years, That's
how life is. I'm looking around my like way too crowded apartment right now, and I'm just like, I don't know how I got this much stuff. It's like death by 1,000 cuts.
Yeah, stuff is weird, It really is, because if you like stuff, you try not to be a hoarder, but if it's useful for you, you go, well, sure, I need this or I want that,
I live in New York City as well. I'm in Astoria, and
you just met.
We should meet at some point. It's just this thing of like, I actually used to do all these in person. Like, I went to Richard's apartment that I think he's been living in for like decades at this point.
I used to live there, yeah. Yeah, because when I first joined the band, I was living on the Upper West Side, and he goes, "Oh, you got to come down to the Village." And like I said, yeah, because the trek was a lot. And his rent, I think, is now what it was then. I mean, he has a really sweetheart deal.
So I used to do these in person, and then the pandemic happened, and I was like, oh, this is just so much easier. You definitely lose a little bit not being face-to-face and talking to people, but just being able to do this all remotely is just been a million times easier.
No, I prefer it too, because, even now there's like whatever RCA, whatever this new thing is that's going around. And I got Omicron after like being boosted like 3 times, so I don't mind.
I've been really good and masking up, but then I started traveling for work, and then I got it a couple times in quick succession.
Yeah, when I got it, I knew exactly where I got it too. I mean, it's great. You just kind of remember that situation. You go, it was there.
I know you've been dealing with some really major health issues over the years.
I want nothing to do with that. And I got to say, when I got this Omicron thing, it was reminiscent of that. It was really painful. It's like weird. But yeah, I can't afford to, to do anything like that. It's good. It's funny you ask. I'm seeing my oncologist tomorrow. I always tell people, my health is great, if I can stay away from the doctors, I feel good. I'm good. And, she's like a really great doctor. And, I take care of myself. Don't need any corn syrup or any of that crap. So I think I'm okay.
It's just one of those things that you can take care of yourself, but especially when you've been through it a couple of times, you have to be really mindful and you have to be very vigilant about it.
Yeah. Well, and then also I remember, being diagnosed, and I told the doctor, I said, I've done this and I've done that and I've done this and I've done that and I've done that. And I did this and I did that. And they go, well, that isn't how you got it. And we don't know how you got it. I'm like
I smoked at some point, something like that.
Well, yeah. And a lot of other things, but they, they're like, no, this isn't how you got this. So I go, okay.
How transformative, if at all, is that an experience that once you go through it, that you reconsider the state of your life?
Your life, everybody else's life, the fragility of things. Everything. Just how nothing is promised. And how you should spend whatever time you have here doing, what you think you should be doing, and, keeping yourself, and happy, for lack of better terms. It really does bring that. You're really on the brink of the edge, and you go, okay, well, people ask me about this, and I remember thinking when I was going through the, treatment, the chemo and the radiation, which is worse than the disease, by the way. And I remember thinking, like, God, you've been such a jerk to everybody. Like, you should have been nicer to people, because you could be gone soon. And then, like, 5 minutes later, I was thinking, you let everybody push you around. You're such a fucking little wuss. I mean, your mind goes through these things. And I've talked to other people about this that were isolated during COVID and had the same thoughts, I mean, so, yeah, it is transformative. It really is. It's like in everything I do now, it's like, do I really need to do that? No, I'm not going to. But before it has to be done.
You've continually been making music for decades, but did it impact your desire to, write and record your own stuff?
Yeah. Well, I mean, my opinion has always been, as long as I'm making music, I'm making music. I don't have to be fronting a band, or I think if I'm producing something, I'm making music. If I'm playing guitar on somebody's thing, I'm making music. But this made me realize that, okay, you should be writing and playing songs while the time you're here. This is what you should be doing, and you should just spend all of your time doing it, or most of it, aside from the other stuff that pays, but that's what you should be doing. Yeah. I mean, because, and even, I mean, I remember this quote from Leonard Bernstein, and his son asked him, like, do you have any regrets? And he goes, well, I wish I'd written more, because he's this famous composer, do you know how he did the music for On the Waterfront? Yeah. I mean,
that was his first film?
That was his first film, yeah.
Oh, wild. No, I didn't know that.
So anyway, I mean, from someone like him, it's like, I mean, you realize that you should probably be, writing, or if that's what you do, or, yeah. So it was transformative in a big way.
Does it influence the lyrical content?
No. I can't, let me think about that. No, because I'm not writing about it, I mean, I wrote kind of morbid things before this all happened. I am working on a song called The Night, which kind of addresses this whole thing. But no, I can't say it changes it. And the lyrics are about whatever situation I'm singing about or talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I ask specifically because on this new record, and I know, I know press material can really kind of go either way in terms of accuracy, but it effectively says that it's set against the contemporary socio-political stage, but also just that it's sort of a product of the last several years. So obviously you're working through something on there.
Well, yeah, I mean, but then again, a lot of these things, these thoughts came to me before COVID, before I was ill and all that. I mean, one of the songs was written years ago, the song I'm Not a Drone Alone. And it's kind of apocalyptic in a way. It's like kind of inspired by the movie Rollerball. There's a scene in Rollerball where they're like all these I can't say, people that, what's the word? Anyway, they're entitled. Okay, they're entitled, and they're on this ridge, and one of their games is to take flare guns and shoot trees and kill them. And this had such a strong impression on me. I don't know why. And I was living up on East 3rd Street, above a men's homeless shelter. And those two things made me write the song. And then it was one of those things that had been in the can for years. And I just when I was making this album, thought, okay, I'm going to finish this and I'm going to make it happen. And it was pretty much right before COVID. A lot of this record was written right before the lockdown, because I was locked down then. You understand? Like I couldn't really go anywhere or anything like that. And I couldn't muddle my way back and forth to the studio. And then as soon as I was ready to go, hey guys, what's happening? The world shut down.
Not nearly on the scale that you did, but I was dealing with some health problems early on in the pandemic, and it was, for me, it was the end of March, beginning of April, and yours came back March 2020. Is that right? Just right as COVID was really hitting New York? Yeah.
Well, it's just, the irony of everything sometimes. I mean, it's just, after you've seen this cycle so much. You go, okay, well, here goes this situation. Of course, it's going to work out like this, Yeah, I mean, but it was. I mean, you living here as well. It was scary. It reminded me of like the plague, It's like, I mean, bring out your dead and the bells ringing and stuff, because like there was sirens all the time. It was a frightening situation. And when I tell people from other cities, I mean, so listen, we live on top of each other. We're literally like crammed together in this space. So you're afraid that it might happen to you.
A very vivid memory of mine from that time is my office, which I don't go into anymore, but my office is on Broadway and 8th. And I was seeing all these, like all the Wire reporter photos, everything that was coming out of the city at the time. And there was parked directly across the street from my office was one of those Walmart Mack trucks with the Walmart logo, everything painted white. And it was a refrigerator truck, and they were just holding bodies.
Of course, yeah. I mean, when we saw it on the news or whatever, it's still surreal. I mean, that you think that kind of thing is happening in this day and age. You think, okay, well, yeah, maybe during like some kind of horrific event in the past or something, this could have happened, and we realize it. But no, this happened. This kind of sprang up on us like that in the present, like today.
For you as a professional musician, what did you do during those, I guess, 2 years?
It was weird, actually. I got a lot of work from overseas, mastering people's records from Europe and from South America. I worked on this record, and that's basically what I did. I couldn't perform anywhere, and I mean, I unfortunately wasn't one of those people that got it together to have the performance come out of their house and all that. I thought, no, I haven't finished this record yet. I'm just going to finish the record. And that's what I did, and I got mastering work, and that's pretty much how I got through that. One thing that really helped me realize that I'd always taken for granted, and a lot of people took for granted, is how much we need other people to do our work. I mean, you need a room full of people to perform to, and you just kind of took for granted they'd always be there, blah blah blah. But without that, then you can't play. There's no performance. There's no place to actually do a live performance, and it's something that at least I had completely taken for granted before this.
It's not this way for everyone, but for most people, that's kind of the point of making music, is so that people hear it.
Well, yeah. I mean, unless you're a painter, even they, I imagine, have to have someone else involved. But unless you're a painter, you need other people to do it. And to play the music with you as well.
Did you move to the city specifically to pursue music?
Yeah, because I moved here from Croatia, but I mean, technically England. That's why I came here, because I'd heard of this kind of thing happening here, this kind of movement. Even over in Croatia, I heard about it. I would read Melody Maker, one of those mags, and there was something sparking in New York. And I wanted to write. I wanted to be in a band that wrote music and played original music. So that's why I moved here, yeah.
Looking at the timeline, it seems like things happen incredibly fast for you. I mean, within a year, if not less, you were playing with the Voidoids.
It was like 2 months, I mean, but yeah, I mean, what can I say? I mean, I'd been on the road with the Foundations for a better part of a year. I moved here to play music, and I put an ad in the paper that said, have gear, we'll travel.
This was The Voice, right?
It was actually a paper called The Musicians Classified. It doesn't exist anymore. That used to come out. I think they were based on 30th Street, on the Music Street.
And Richard responded, and
well, it's odd because I came back from Europe. Okay, I put this ad in the paper, and I was staying with a friend on the Upper West Side, as I said. Put this ad in the paper, went down and saw my folks, and then came back. And because it took like a month or so for the paper, to print the ad and for the new issue to come out, there was an article about Richard on the front of this paper, written by Anya Phillips, with a big picture of him. And my ad was on the back page in the classified. So they called me. They were looking through it. I mean, and Klein was kind of the one that was kind of orchestrating the whole thing. Called me up, and I came down and auditioned, and that was that.
You said that you had kind of read or heard about this scene that was coming together in the city, but how familiar were you actually with the music?
None at all. I mean, to me, it was just rock and roll, and I mean, and you know, I remember Lenny Kaye wrote for a magazine called Rock Scene, and even before, when I was living in in Maryland, I mean, we would get Rock Scene and look at all these weird things that were happening up there, and people hanging out in clubs, and and all that. That's as familiar as I was with it, with anything. I hadn't heard anything. I heard the Dolls, and who else? That was about it, because the Dolls did some TV appearances, But as far as what was really brewing with like Patty and Richard and Television and the Tough Darts and all these other bands, countless bands, you can't name the Talking Heads yet because they weren't part of the scene in the beginning,
It clicked pretty quickly with the group.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's like they had great. To me, they had three songs at the time. Blank Generation, Love Comes in Spurts, and You Gotta Lose.
That's a pretty good trio of songs to start with.
Yeah, but I mean, they weren't really finished, and they said, "Okay, well, we have this. Can you play that?" And I just did. I mean, I just played, whatever parts. And what really attracted me to the band was Richard's bass playing, because I mean, his bass playing is really unique. People criticize him for it, but I thought it was great. Especially his bass line on "You Gotta Lose" is like brilliant.
Verlaine was out of the group already by the time you came along?
They had completely parted. I mean, I had no idea that Tom Verlaine and Richard even knew each other, I mean, this was Quine, Richard, and Mark Bell, or Marky Ramone at the time. So that whole scene had taken place before I even got to town, with the Neon Boys and all that.
I'm fascinated, having just found out today that you were a touring member of the Foundations. How did that come about? Once
again, I saved all my money. I worked in a law firm in downtown DC, a corporate law firm, as a paralegal. I don't know how I got that gig. This is all, I mean, I don't know. I mean, and anyway, I saved every dime I had. I mean, I sometimes slept on people's couches because I wanted to go to England, I saved the money. I went there, and then I put out ads in papers once again. Nothing really panned out. I mean, it's very kind of secular. Like, it's like, I wasn't from the Mersey River or something like that, and blah, blah, blah. And then I met these people at the Town and Country Pub one night, and they said, okay, we're going to come pick you up tomorrow morning. We're going to take you to this rehearsal studio called Manny's Rehearsal Studio. Okay? And then you go there and you'll meet Manny, and he'll help you find a band. So I met this guy, Manny, and he was really great and sweet. And he goes, okay, you sit here at the front desk, and a band will come through, and they'll need a guitar player. So I sat there for a week or so. And then during that time sitting there, that's where I met Topper Headon, from the Clash, because he was playing with Gary Moore. So, yeah, I mean, and I bought him scones every day to pay my rent or something.
Because I know he wasn't the original drummer. Was he in the band at that point?
No, he was, like I said, he was playing this guy. His name is Gary Moore, who was a blues guitar player. And they were rehearsing to go out on tours. This was a place where it's kind of like at the SIR, the Studio Instrument Rental, like a rehearsal space of London at the time, but on a much smaller scale. I mean, it wasn't as dressed up or anything. But yeah, so he was doing that. So we started up a conversation, and we would talk and everything. But yeah, and so the Foundations came in, and they had fired their guitar player, and or the guitar player probably quit because these guys worked so much. I mean, you talk about 8 days a week. I mean, they were literally on the road all the time. Like sometimes two gigs in two different cities, And so they needed a guitar player. So I went in and played, and they seemed to like what I do. And then, like 3 days later, after learning the songs, off we go.
I assume that at that point you were familiar with the Foundations. I mean, they were a pretty big deal for a while.
No, I wasn't. Remember, regardless of what you might have read, like my real heroes were like, John Lee Hooker, Howlin' Wolf, Keith Richards, That's who I was studying to learn guitar. Of course, I heard top 40 radio, and I heard that Build Me Up Buttercup, but I was 11 at the time, and I really thought they were from Detroit.
Yeah, they sound like an American soul band.
Yeah, and they did it really well. Yeah,
It sounds like you're sort of ultimately fairly agnostic to the genre that you're playing. I mean, I say this because, again, like, you know, I mentioned Richard, and then the other folks that I have had on the show that you have been in groups with are Dave Allen, Cynthia Slay, and Matthew Sweet. And that's all over the board. Especially the band that you were in with Cynthia was sort of like African influenced.
Really? I think Dave Allen was more African influenced than we were, but I mean. Well, actually, I mean, I'm thinking back to that record. We did use a lot of kind of like, you know, African percussion and stuff like that. Yeah. And also, you know, to take to your point, I mean, I had previously been hanging out with Giorgio Gomelski. You should really know Giorgio Gomelski. I mean, he's not around anymore. Giorgio Gomelski was the original manager for the Yardbirds. He managed the Stones for a short time. And he was living in New York City on 24th Street. And I hung out with him a lot. And he turned me on to Fela Kuti and all this like great African acts, you know, that he was really into. And I took part of that probably to that band.
It's interesting, reading up how influenced you were by Hendrix early on, because I still hear that in your voice.
Believe me, I'm not trying. I'm so far away from emulating him because he's just someone to me is like that's, like I said, it was the first concert I saw. My friend's older brother, I didn't say that to you, but like my friend's older brother took me there when I was like 13 years old, you know? And it just blew my mind. Actually, I just try to get by with singing.
It might be subconscious, but you know, at least one of the songs I was listening to, I was like, yeah, there's a little bit of that.
People have compared my playing, especially when I was with Matthew, because I mean, Matthew gave me like this kind of open space, this venue, I'll call it, where I could just play whatever I wanted and have fun, you know. And it wasn't until like people started writing that I thought, well, let me listen to some Hendrix. I haven't listened to Hendrix in like 2 decades or 3 decades. And one thing I got from his playing is that he just has fun. It's like the things he's doing, especially while he's soloing, he's just like, it's not overly thought. It's just, you know, visceral, you know? So, I mean, that's that, but I don't know. You scared me.
No, listen, there are worse things in the world than being compared to Hendrix.
There are always worse things in the world, yeah.
I think when we first start doing the thing that we want to do, we're imitating in a lot of cases. I know that you like, and I hope this is a right fact, but I think you were in a Led Zeppelin cover band at one point.
Oh yeah, because
when we start our creative pursuits, we're imitating, and then we find our own voices. But I think for a lot of people in a lot of cases, you still can't shake those really foundational influences.
Well, I'll agree with you, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, because I think almost everybody's heroes are derivative of something. You know, the heroes themselves were. You know, I mean, that's one of the reasons I love Keith Richards, because he turned America onto its culture that it never heard or seen, or seen before, and he still can't shake that. You know, he's still doing Chuck Berry riffs or whatever. I mean, to some degree, you know,
he does all right for himself.
Well, yeah.
You traveled a lot early on. You were your father was in the Navy. I know you're initially from DC, but you were in Haiti and Cuba at various points.
Haiti for a second. I mean, I think I can't remember why. I was very young, why we were there and how long we were there. But Cuba, I lived until my formative years on Guantanamo until it was like about 11, I think, when we got back from ages 5 to 11.
What was that experience like, being on that base for so long?
Well, I mean, I'm sure there's other people like that, you know, Navy or Army brats that have the same experience. It's isolating. I mean, but it depends on what age group you're in. I mean, I'd heard stories of teenagers or people that were like 15 or 16 that where it was absolutely hell for them, because there was one radio station that was government controlled. I mean, the one song I remember hearing was "On Top of Old Smoky" by Burl Ives. You would not hear any rock and roll, and also you were far enough away from the states where, like, you know, it couldn't be piped in. But I was a child, so for me it was paradise. Like blue waters, blue skies, fishing. Yeah, I loved it. Yeah, I really did. I mean, I was there during the missile crisis as well, or at least we got evacuated during that time, and that made me realize that it wasn't all so hunky dory or as I thought it was, because the world was in crisis. Especially when I moved back here. When I moved back here. That was a huge culture shock. Just being America was in like 1962.
At least in some ways, probably in a good way. I mean, in terms of, I guess, was it moving back to DC? Is that where you heard rock and roll for the first time?
When we moved back for good. In like 1965. We moved back for good. That's when I discovered AM radio. I discovered the Trogs. I just discovered all these kind of great like singles bands that were making records at the time. The Beatles, the Stones. The Kinks. Motown. All this stuff, and all this stuff was being played on one radio station as well. That was the great thing. Is that like you would hear like Satisfaction, and then you would hear Reach Out and I'll Be There, and you hear the Supremes, and then you hear it's like all this great stuff. It was amazing. And I've always loved music. But it really caught me as something that I really wanted to be very much a part of. Yeah. And I thinking about it, I was lucky enough to live in a city that had great radio stations, but not all did, and not all do. Did you grow up in New York?
I grew up in the Bay Area, so there was pretty good radio stations out there. Yeah.
New York, what surprised me the first time I came here was the radio stations were pretty much awful because of and it's been explained to me because of the demographic that they have to please such a large demographic that like it was just also saccharine and there's nothing. As we drove, because my friends and I, we would drive up. Do you know Ted Nicely? He produced Fugazi. Anyway, we grew up together as kids, and along with HR and I, like HR and I and Bad Boys, we all went to the same high school. It is wild. It is wild.
They would have been maybe a little younger than you, right?
No, Ted's older than me.
HR though?
HR is younger. HR is younger because I think he was a junior when I was like a he was a sophomore when I was a junior, and then Ted was a senior, like that, But anyway, we would decide one day, I don't know how, because all my friends were older at the time. We would get in the car, we would drive up to New York, and we would touch the Fillmore East. And we would drive back in time for class the next day.
Touch the Fillmore East? Like just walk up to the building and physically touch it?
Because by the time we got here, it was like 11 at night. We were all too young to get in, or at least maybe even 12 or 1 at night. So yeah, we'd go up and we'd just touch it, and then we would drive back down. But one thing where I'm going with this is like the radio stations, when we got to Philly, they were great. And then after that, they got progressively worse as we got to New York City. And they're like, where's the radio? Where's the music? And it was like, awful. But that changed over the years too. There's been some good stations here since then.
Now it's kind of a moot point. It almost feels like, just nobody really listens to the radio anymore. And it's all consolidated and corporatized.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I don't. When I walk into stores and they have it on, I'm like, please.
Did you say you were in Croatia at one point?
Yes. Yugoslavia at the time. And what's that? There in Serbia, Macedonia. Because what happened is like the foundations went to Yugoslavia to do a tour, and we toured all over. And then that's when I realized that like I can't be with these guys because they're not writing. They've had their hits. They
were on the downslope by the time you got there.
Yeah, maybe so. Yeah, I mean, kind of like the people who play Vegas. You can't say they're on a downslope. They're just like making their money, and
Well, they're on the downslope from the peak, obviously.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, most definitely. Yeah. Because this was like 10 years later at the time that they did something. And once again, I was young. I mean, thinking of it, I was like only 20 years old or something. Kind of crazy. And I wanted to write. I wanted to be in a band that actually made music. So I stayed in Yugoslavia with the band that opened for us called Parne Valjak, which means steamroller. And we talked, and they loved, a lot of the same music. So Foundations went back to England. I stayed there, and I did another leg of the tour with a guest guitarist with them, excuse me. And then after that tour was over, came to New York.
That's a big decision to just stick around with the bands in a new country where I assume that you don't speak the language. Well,
it was odd. It's talking about the language. I learned the language to some degree. I can speak a bit of it today, a tiny bit. But it was the first language that I heard that wasn't Latin based. It wasn't like French or Spanish. It was completely different, So I had to function. I had to learn how to, ask for a glass of water, go to the bathroom, blah, 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 where's the key to my hotel? These kind of things. I learned it. And I still have friends there, and I had a really great time there. I thought it was really a huge crime. But they told me, there was a leader, I guess you got prime minister or something you call him. His name was Tito. That got him through the Second World War. And they told me when Tito dies, he's the only Yugoslavian, and the country's going to just completely split up. And that's exactly what happened.
What made you stay with them?
Because I felt like I had to just kind of take a respite and have a perch before I moved to New York. I felt like, okay. And these guys were playing, music, and they asked me to come on the tour. It's not like I asked them; they asked me. And I thought, yeah, this will give me a month or so to kind of sort myself out, get my stuff out of England, and then move to New York.
New York was always on the horizon for you.
No, not until this point in my life. Because, like I said, I started hearing things about. Actually, when you asked me that, it's like, like I said, I worked for the law firm, to save money to get out. And they would send me here to do research, to deliver huge tech checks and things like that on the shuttle. And I would, come here, and rather than use the money for a hotel, I would just kind of wander around the city all night because this is young and stupid. But then again, or I'd go to Max's. Because then there was no drinking ages, whatever. No one cared about that kind of thing. And I would see people I'd seen on TV, like Johnny Thunders and these people. Freezing cold outside without a coat or a guitar case. And I decided then, I'm never moving there. It's too rough, man. It's these people. I can't do that. So, that changed over the years. But it wasn't until I thought it was an inner voice. That's all the best way I can describe it. That said, you have to go there and you have to play guitar there. At least try, because you're not going back to DC. That was never on the cards. I was never going to end up back there because there was no creative outlet for me except to play in cover bands of some sort. That's how it was then.
It's interesting that you saw Johnny Thunders at Maxis before the specific scene that you joined. Like you had gotten glimpses of what was going to become punk.
Yeah, I even went there. I went to Club 82, which is like, I think it was a transvestite bar at the time, and I saw Wayne County or Jane County at the time.
Jane County, yeah.
Yeah, and then I think not the Heartbreakers, but the Dolls played there, and that's why I saw them. I got glimpses. And even on the way to the airport when I moved to England, my friend says, "Oh, we're going to stop by CBGB's. And we're going to see this band of brothers called the Ramones." Okay, and we'll do that right, and you'll be able to catch your flight. So we went there. It was Tuesday at 4:00. He thought, and maybe I agreed, that they would just be playing all the time at 4:00 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. I don't know, but of course no one was there on a Tuesday afternoon. But I'd gotten little glimpses, but they didn't really register,
Yeah, it's so funny because I, in a lot of ways, dramatically different, but in some ways similar experience of moving to New York, and CBGB's was still around at the time and really having heard about it, but it was so past its prime by the time I moved here in the, I guess in like the mid to late aughts, that it was just, you read about something, you hear about something for a long time, and then you go and experience it. And obviously, it's not going to be anything like you imagined it would be.
Well, true. Same thing as when I would move to London and I went to the Marquee Club. That was famous for the Who and everything, the Stones and everyone playing, and it was pretty much like CB's was when you went there. It's kind of this empty kind of room, dusty room with nobody in it.
It was interesting when the when all the sort of like say CBGB's events were happening, because it was like, yeah, this is just nobody has paid attention or cared about this place for so long. Now everybody wants to save it, but like, even if they did save it, there's no way it's going back to what it was.
Yeah, after that, after the bands that were there that performed there, and Hilly Let performed there that couldn't play anywhere else, including the Voidoids, and Richard. Even after that, after it reached its peak, it was just, it was done. It was done. Except for one exception, I do remember it was in the 80s, like early 80s sometimes, and I walked by there because I lived very close to there at the time, and Vernon Reid was playing. Living Colour was playing. They kind of brought the place back to life for a while, because it was packed. It was the same thing with the police lines outside and everything.
Speaking of, I guess, how everything around Richard's apartment changed, and you mentioned living on 3rd Street, and even when I moved out here, Bowery was still pretty rough, but obviously a lot of that's changed. The city has just changed dramatically. In a lot of cases, not for the better. What's kept you here for so long?
Oh, God, that's a good question. I ask myself that all the time, especially this time of year.
Especially during the pandemic, I was just like, I'm not leaving my apartment. I don't know why I'm paying this much for rent and never leave my apartment.
Well, I have ties here now. I do somehow still like it, and especially when I go back to the East Village, there's something about it I like. I like that the things that kind of happen. I don't know, the vibrance that's on the street, the immediacy that's on the street, the catalyst that's on the street. I like all that. And I find if I go away from it, I miss it. I was just in Chicago last month and I thought, this is great. And I love Chicago. It's like my second home. But I don't know, there's some kind of, spark that happens here that I really like. To answer your question, beyond that, I can't answer that. I got nowhere else to go. I'm a big fan of the Caribbean. I would love to live down there. Because it's warm and it's beautiful, and I grew up down there. But I'm not in a situation where I can do anything down there.
Certainly, there are perks to being here that you don't get in other places. Like you just played with Richard Lloyd, which is not something you can do elsewhere. There are opportunities and experiences and things that you can do in music that you might not be able to do in another place. Yeah,
and I have a studio here. And my son's here. It's like so. We're here some of the time. I don't know. He just got back from Australia. He's kind of here, but I don't know. It's like why do people live in Cleveland? Why does anybody live anywhere? That just. And I agree with you. I put it this way: I'm not in love with what was, because I don't think like that anyway. Because what was isn't here anymore. So it has completely changed, and especially when you get onto the Bowery and there's a Whole Foods and all that. It's like But I also realized that when I first moved here, because I remember I was sitting in a park near the museum. And I just sat down. I'd been traveling all over the world and sat down and kind of relaxed. And all of a sudden, 3 or 4 people come up and start just bothering me. And it taught me this lesson, in New York, if you sit still too long, it's a bad thing. It's like, you got to keep moving. Everything keeps moving. So you sit still, someone will run over you or try to run over yourself.